August 1st, 1943. 7:10 in the morning. 50 feet above Romanian farmland. Second Lieutenant John McCormick, 23 years old from Akron, Ohio, sat in the nose of the B-24 Liberator Hadley's Harem, watching the ground blur past at impossible speed. Trees, farmhouses, fields, everything rushed by mere feet below the aircraft. Too close. Far too close. One mistake, one updraft, one moment of inattention would slam the bomber into the ground at 200 miles per hour. McCormick could see Romanian farmers in their fields, looking up in shock as American heavy bombers, designed to operate at 20,000 feet, thundered past at eye level. Some waved, some ran. Most just stood frozen, watching the impossible spectacle of four-engine bombers flying lower than some birds. This wasn't how strategic bombing was supposed to work. Heavy bombers stayed high, above anti-aircraft fire, dropping bombs from altitude where fighters and Flak couldn't reach effectively. But Operation Tidal Wave, the raid on Ploesti oil refineries, required a different approach. The target was too important, too heavily defended, too critical to German war effort to attack conventionally. Ploesti produced approximately 30% of Germany's oil supply. Destroy Ploesti and German tanks, aircraft, and ships would run dry. The strategic importance was obvious, but Ploesti was also one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, smoke generators, balloon barges. High-altitude bombing had been tried and failed. Accuracy was inadequate. Damage was minimal. Repairs were quick. So the planners devised ultra-low altitude attack. Bombers would fly at 50 to 100 feet below German radar coverage, approaching the target at treetop level. They would pop up to 300 feet just before the target, drop bombs with delayed fuses, and escape at low altitude before defenses could respond effectively. Surprise was essential. Speed was critical. Timing was everything. But at 7:10 on August 1st, surprise was already compromised. Navigation errors had scattered the bomber formations. Aircraft that should have arrived simultaneously from different directions were straggling in at different times. The carefully planned coordination was falling apart. German defenders, alerted by early arrivals and reconnaissance flights, were manning guns and scrambling fighters. McCormick watched smoke rising ahead. Ploesti was burning already. Earlier waves had attacked. The defenses were fully alert. Hadley's Harem and her squadron were flying in to prepare defenses, not achieving surprise. This wasn't the plan. This was suicide. At 7:12, the first flak burst appeared ahead. Then another. Then dozens. The sky ahead filled with black smoke and orange fire. The bombers were committed. There was no turning back. They had flown 1,200 miles from North Africa across the Mediterranean. Fuel was limited. The mission had to be completed. McCormick braced himself as Hadley's Harem flew into the inferno. In the next 20 minutes, 53 B-24 Liberators would be shot down. Over 660 American airmen would be killed, wounded, or captured. 5 Medals of Honor would be awarded, the most ever for a single mission, and Ploesti would be damaged but not destroyed, repaired within weeks, continuing to produce oil for Germany. This is the story of Operation Tidal Wave, of the raid that required bombers to fly at altitudes designed for fighters, of the mission where 30% casualties were accepted as necessary cost, of the airmen who knew it was a suicide mission but went anyway, of the 5 men whose heroism under fire earned the nation's highest honor, and of the strategic failure that questioned whether the terrible sacrifice achieved anything worth the cost. Ploesti, located 40 miles north of Bucharest, Romania, was one of the most important industrial targets in Axis-controlled Europe. The oil refineries at Ploesti represented concentrated vulnerability in German war machine. Germany's synthetic oil production from coal provided some petroleum products, but couldn't meet all military requirements. Natural oil from Romania was essential. Ploesti's refineries processed Romanian crude oil into aviation fuel, diesel, and other products necessary for German military operations. The numbers were stark. Ploesti produced approximately 10 million tons of oil products annually, roughly 30% of Germany's total petroleum supply. The refineries at Ploesti provided fuel for Luftwaffe fighters, panzer divisions, U-boats, and transport vehicles across all theaters. Without Ploesti, German mobile warfare would grind to halt. Allied strategic planners understood Ploesti's importance. Destroy Ploesti, and German operational capabilities would be severely constrained. Tanks immobilized for lack of fuel couldn't conduct offensives. Aircraft grounded for lack of aviation fuel couldn't contest Allied air superiority. Ships in port for lack of diesel couldn't threaten supply lines. But destroying Ploesti was extraordinarily difficult. The refineries were large, complex, and dispersed across multiple sites. Previous high-altitude bombing raids in 1942 had achieved minimal results. Bombing from 20,000 feet lacked the accuracy to hit specific refinery components. Bombs that missed critical infrastructure caused limited damage. Ploesti's engineers repaired damage quickly, often within days. Moreover, Ploesti was heavily defended. German and Romanian forces had constructed formidable defenses. Approximately 200 heavy anti-aircraft guns ringed the refineries. Multiple fighter squadrons operated from nearby airfields. Smoke generators could obscure targets within minutes. Barrage balloons forced bombers to higher altitudes where accuracy decreased further. By mid-1943, Allied planners concluded that conventional high-altitude attacks wouldn't destroy Ploesti. A different approach was necessary. The solution was Operation Tidal Wave, ultra-low altitude attack that would achieve surprise, maximize accuracy, and overwhelm defenses through speed and coordination. The plan was audacious. 177 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers would fly from North Africa, across the Mediterranean, over Albania and Yugoslavia, into Romania. The route was over 1,200 miles each way, at the extreme range of B-24 capabilities, even with auxiliary fuel tanks. The bombers would fly at low altitude to avoid radar detection, navigate using landmarks and dead reckoning, and arrive at Ploesti simultaneously from multiple directions. At the target, formations would pop up to 300 feet, drop bombs with delayed fuses, and escape at low altitude. The delayed fuses would allow bombers to clear the target area before bombs detonated, minimizing damage from their own explosions. The simultaneous attacks from multiple directions would overwhelm defenses and prevent effective response. The plan required perfect execution. Navigation had to be precise. Getting lost meant running out of fuel over enemy territory. Timing had to be exact. Arriving at different times would lose the advantage of simultaneous attack. Coordination had to be flawless. Formations attacking from wrong directions would bomb friendly aircraft, and the plan accepted extraordinarily high casualties. Planners estimated losses of 25 to 30%. This meant approximately 50 bombers wouldn't return. Over 500 airmen would be killed, wounded, or captured. These losses were deemed acceptable given Ploesti's strategic importance. Preparation for Operation Tidal Wave began in June 1943. The 177 B-24s and their crews assembled at bases in Libya, Benghazi, and Benina airfields. The aircraft came from 9th Air Force units already operating in North Africa theater. The crews knew they were preparing for an important mission, but didn't initially know the target. Security was tight. The training program emphasized low-altitude formation flying, navigation by landmarks, and coordination between formations attacking from different directions. Low-altitude training was particularly challenging. B-24 pilots were accustomed to flying at 15,000 to 25,000 feet, altitudes where aircraft operated efficiently and defenses were less effective. Flying at 50 to 100 feet required completely different skills and mindset. At low altitude, there was no margin for error. A momentary loss of control meant crashing into ground. Turbulence from terrain and other aircraft made formation flying difficult. Visibility was limited. Pilots couldn't see beyond immediate obstacles. The psychological stress was immense. Flying heavy bomber at altitudes designed for fighters was terrifying for pilots trained for high-altitude operations. The crews practiced repeatedly over Libyan desert, flying in formation at 50 feet, navigating by landmarks, coordinating attacks on mock targets. The training was dangerous even without enemy fire. Several aircraft crashed during practice missions, killing crews. In late July, the crews were finally briefed on the target. The mission was Ploesti. The reaction was mixed. Some crews were excited by the strategic importance. Others were apprehensive about the risks. All understood the mission would be extraordinarily dangerous. The final briefing came on July 31st. Detailed target photographs, intelligence assessments, and tactical plans were presented. Each formation had specific refineries to attack. Routes were plotted. Timing was synchronized. Crews were told to expect heavy losses, but that the mission was essential to shortening the war. Colonel Keith Compton would lead the first wave, the Liberandos formation attacking white targets. Colonel John Kane would lead pink formation attacking red targets. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker would lead blue formation attacking white 4 and 5 targets. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Johnson would lead the 8 balls attacking White 1. Colonel Jack would lead Pyramidas attacking Blue target. The commanders were experienced officers, many with combat tours completed. Several had volunteered for this mission, knowing it might be one-way trip. Their leadership would be critical. Crews would follow their commanders into hell if necessary. August 1st was set as mission date. Weather was forecast to be clear. Moon phase was favorable for navigation. Romanian defenses were believed to be at normal readiness, not alert for major attack. On the evening of July 31st, crews prepared their aircraft and equipment. Bombs were loaded, high explosive and incendiary mixtures designed to destroy refinery infrastructure and ignite petroleum products. Ammunition was loaded for defensive guns. Extra fuel tanks were filled. Personal items were secured. Letters were written just in case. Many crews attended religious services. Chaplains were busy throughout the evening. Some men prayed. Some slept. Some sat quietly, contemplating what tomorrow would bring. All knew that not everyone would return. August 1st, 1943, began before dawn at Benghazi and Benina airfields. The 177 B-24s started engines in darkness. The sound was tremendous. Over 700 engines roaring simultaneously. Ground crews made final checks. Crews boarded aircraft, settling into positions they'd occupied hundreds of times in training. At 0400 hours, the first bombers began rolling. Takeoff was staggered. 177 heavy bombers couldn't launch simultaneously from the available runways. The departure took over an hour. Aircraft circled, forming up into formations as planned. By 0530 hours, all 177 bombers were airborne, organized into 5 main formations. The Armada turned north toward the Mediterranean. The mission was underway. There was no turning back. The route took the bombers north across the Mediterranean, then northeast over Albania, Yugoslavia, and into Romania. Total distance was approximately 1,200 miles, at maximum range for B-24s even with auxiliary tanks. Fuel management would be critical. Running out of fuel meant ditching in sea or crash landing in enemy territory. The bombers flew at low altitude from departure, staying below radar coverage. This meant flying at 50 to 200 feet over water, then transitioning to terrain following flight over land. Pilots maintained altitude by visual reference to waves, then ground features. There were no altimeters accurate enough at such low heights. It was flying by instinct and experience. The Mediterranean crossing was relatively uneventful. The weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. Formation flying was smooth. Crews began to relax, slightly. Perhaps the mission would go as planned. But as the formations crossed into Albania and began navigating through mountains, problems emerged. The lead navigator in the Liberandos formation made critical error. Instead of turning at the correct checkpoint, a distinctive peak, the formation continued straight. By the time the error was recognized, the formation was miles off course. The Liberandos formation, which was supposed to attack first and achieve surprise, was now heading toward Bucharest instead of Ploesti. Colonel Compton realized the error but faced terrible choice. Turn back and try to find correct route, burning precious fuel and losing surprise, or continue to alternate target. Compton chose to continue to Bucharest, hoping other formations would attack Ploesti as planned. But the navigation error had cascading effects. The pink, blue, 8 balls and Pyramidas formations following behind Liberandos initially followed the incorrect route before recognizing the mistake. Time was lost. Formation integrity was compromised. The carefully synchronized attack plan was falling apart. By 0930 hours, the bomber formations approaching Romania were scattered across hundreds of square miles of airspace. The synchronized attack that depended on all formations arriving simultaneously from different directions was impossible. Aircraft arrived at different times, from different directions, attacking different targets than originally planned. Worse, surprise was completely lost. Romanian and German observers had spotted American bombers crossing into Romanian airspace. Air raid warnings were sounded. Anti-aircraft gun crews manned their positions. Fighter squadrons scrambled. Smoke generators at Ploesti began operating, obscuring refineries. The German defenders had approximately 30 minutes warning, enough time to prepare, but not enough to evacuate or hide. The gunners loaded weapons, ranged their sights, and waited. The fighter pilots started engines and took off, climbing to intercept altitude. The trap was set. Colonel Kane's pink formation, having corrected navigation error, approached Ploesti from the south at 1,000 hours. Kane could see smoke rising from the refineries, both from smoke generators and from fires started by Liberandos formation that had mistakenly bombed Ploesti on their way to Bucharest. The defenses were fully alert. There would be no surprise. Kane faced a decision that would define his legacy. The mission plan was compromised. Surprise was lost. Defenses were prepared. He could abort, turn away, save his formation, accept mission failure. Or he could attack. Fly into prepared defenses at low altitude, where every gun would have clear shot. Kane made his decision. He would attack. His formation would complete the mission regardless of cost. Over the radio, "We're going in." The pink formation, 21 B-24s, descended to 50 feet and accelerated toward target. Behind them, blue formation under Lieutenant Colonel Baker and 8 Balls formation under Lieutenant Colonel Johnson were making the same decision. They would attack despite compromised surprise, despite prepared defenses, despite almost certain catastrophic casualties. The crews in those formations understood what was coming. They could see the flak already bursting ahead. They could hear air raid sirens even over the roar of engines. They knew bombers ahead were being shot down. They could see smoke from crashes. But they were committed. They would complete the mission or die trying. At 1005 hours, Colonel Kane's pink formation entered the outer defensive ring around Ploesti. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The sky erupted in flak. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns firing simultaneously at point-blank range. At 50 feet altitude, the bombers were flying directly into the muzzles of guns designed to engage aircraft at thousands of feet. The German 88mm flak guns, positioned on towers and rooftops, could depress their barrels and fire almost horizontally. The lighter 37mm and 20mm guns mounted at ground level had perfect targets. Massive 4-engine bombers flying straight and level mere feet off the ground. The flak wasn't the distant black puffs that high-altitude crews were accustomed to seeing. This was direct fire at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. Tracer rounds created solid walls of light. Explosive shells detonated among the bombers, shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin. The noise was beyond comprehension. Engines roaring, guns firing, explosions, metal tearing. The B-24 Jose Carioca took direct hit to the cockpit. The pilot was killed instantly. The co-pilot, wounded, struggled to maintain control as the bomber veered wildly. The aircraft crashed into a refinery building, exploding in massive fireball that engulfed surrounding structures. 10 men died in the crash. The B-24 Kickapoo was hit in the wing tanks. Fuel ignited, creating trail of flame behind the bomber. The pilot, Captain Ralph Thompson, held formation despite the fire, continuing toward the target. At the bombing point, Thompson held the bomber steady while the bombardier released bombs. Only after bombs were away did Thompson order bailout. The crew escaped moments before the bomber exploded. Thompson survived and was captured. The B-24 brewery wagon took multiple hits to engines. 2 engines failed. The bomber lost altitude, falling behind formation. At 30 feet altitude with engines on fire, the pilot crash-landed in a field. Most of the crew survived the crash, but were immediately captured by Romanian troops. These were not isolated incidents. Across the formations attacking Ploesti, bombers were being hit, damaged, destroyed at catastrophic rate. The anti-aircraft fire was so dense that some crews reported they couldn't see the ground to the flak bursts. But the bombers kept coming. Formation discipline held. Pilots who saw the aircraft ahead explode flew through the debris and continued toward target. Crews who knew their bomber was fatally damaged stayed at stations until bombs were released. The mission continued despite losses that would normally cause formations to abort. Colonel John Riley Kane, 33 years old from San Antonio, Texas, led pink formation through the inferno with determination that became legendary. Kane's bomber, Hail Columbia, was in the lead position, the most dangerous spot because it drew concentrated fire. At 1007 hours, Hail Columbia took multiple hits. Engines were damaged. Hydraulics were hit, affecting control surfaces. Fuel tanks were punctured, leaking gasoline. Fire started in one engine. The damage was severe enough that any reasonable commander would have aborted, turned away, attempted emergency landing, saved crew. Kane didn't abort. He continued toward target, maintaining formation lead. His bomber was leaving trail of smoke and fuel. Other crews could see Hail Columbia was dying but still flying. The example was powerful. If Kane could continue despite fatal damage, they could continue despite whatever they were experiencing. The target for pink formation was Concordia Vega Refinery, one of Ploesti's largest facilities. The route took the formation directly over the refinery's distillation towers, cracking plants, and storage tanks. This was the most heavily defended section of Ploesti because it was the most valuable infrastructure. At 1,009 hours, Kane ordered the pop-up maneuver. The formation climbed from 50 feet to 300 feet, gaining altitude to clear obstacles and improve bombing accuracy. This made the bombers even more vulnerable to flak because they were exposed longer and were easier targets at 300 feet than at 50 feet. Hail Columbia, trailing smoke and fire, led the climb. Behind Kane, 20 B-24s followed, maintaining formation discipline despite losses. Some aircraft had engines out. Some were on fire. Some had wounded crew members. All stayed in formation. At 300 feet over the target, bombardiers released bombs. The delayed fuse bombs fell into refinery infrastructure, hitting distillation towers, cracking units, storage tanks. The bombers didn't wait to see results. With bombs away, Kane ordered descent back to 50 feet and maximum speed escape. But Hail Columbia was too damaged to maintain speed. The bomber fell behind, losing altitude. Kane ordered crew to bail out, but stayed at controls to keep aircraft stable while crew escaped. 8 crew members bailed out successfully. Kane and 2 others stayed with aircraft, crash landing in a field. All 3 survived and were captured. Kane's actions earned a Medal of Honor, the first awarded for Operation Tidal Wave. The citation emphasized his determination to complete the mission despite fatal damage to his aircraft, his leadership maintaining formation discipline through intense fire, and his sacrifice in staying with damaged bomber to ensure crew could escape safely. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Earl Baker, 26 years old from Chicago, Illinois, commanded Blue Formation. 14 B-24s targeting White 4 and White 5 refineries. Baker's bomber was Hell's Wench, flying in lead position. Accompanying Baker as co-pilot was Major John Lewis Jerstad, 28 years old from Racine, Wisconsin. Jerstad's presence was unusual. He had already completed a combat tour and had earned the right to go home. But Jerstad had volunteered to fly one more mission, specifically Operation Tidal Wave, because of its strategic importance. Jerstad knew the risks. He chose to accept them anyway. At 1,012 hours, approaching the target, Hell's Wench took direct hit to the nose. The bombardier was killed instantly. Fire erupted in the forward fuselage. The intercom was destroyed, preventing communication between crew members. Baker and Jerstad could see the fire spreading, but had no way to communicate with the rest of the crew. The damage was catastrophic. Any normal response would be to bail out immediately, while altitude allowed parachutes to deploy. But Baker and Jerstad faced the same decision Kane had faced: abort and save lives, or continue and complete mission. They continued. Hell's Wench, engulfed in flames forward of the cockpit, maintained position leading Blue Formation. Other crews watching were horrified and inspired. The lead bomber was clearly doomed but was still flying, still leading, still pressing toward target. At 1,014 hours, Hell's Wench reached the bombing point. Despite the fire, despite the dead bombardier, despite communication failures, the remaining crew manually released bombs over White 5 refinery. The bombs fell into target. Mission accomplished. Moments after bombs release, Hell's Wench exploded. The fire reached fuel tanks. The bomber disintegrated in massive fireball. Baker, Jerstad, and the remaining crew members died instantly. There was no time to bail out. They had known this was likely outcome, but had chosen to complete mission anyway. Both Baker and Jerstad were posthumously awarded Medals of Honor. Baker's citation recognized his decision to continue despite fatal damage and certain death. Jerstad's citation emphasized that he had volunteered for the mission despite having already completed his tour, knowing the extraordinary risks, specifically because of the mission's importance. The dual award was unique. 2 men in same aircraft, making same decision, sharing same fate, both earning the nation's highest honor for valor. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes, 24 years old from Alexandria, Louisiana, piloted B-24 Gremlins in Colonel Johnson's 8-ball formation. Hughes was attacking White 1 refinery, the Stoa Romana facility, one of Ploesti's most heavily defended targets. At 1,018 hours, approaching the target at 50 feet altitude, Gremlins flew through explosion from bomb that had been dropped by aircraft ahead. The shockwave rocked the bomber. More critically, flaming debris struck the right wing, igniting fuel leaking from damaged tank. The wing caught fire immediately. The flame spread rapidly along the wing's surface toward the fuselage. The heat was intense enough that crew members could feel it through the aircraft's skin. The bomber was dying. Fuel fire on wingman explosion was imminent. Hughes had seconds to decide. He could turn away from target, attempt emergency landing, possibly save crew. Or he could continue. Complete bombing run, almost certainly die in explosion. Hughes continued. Gremlins maintained formation, maintained course, maintained altitude despite the wing fire that was clearly visible to every crew in the formation. The example was powerful beyond words. Here was bomber literally burning to death, but still completing mission. At 1,020 hours, Gremlins reached bombing point. The bombardier released bombs into Stoa Romana refinery. The delayed fuse bombs fell true, hitting critical infrastructure. Mission accomplished. Hughes attempted escape. He pulled up, tried to gain altitude that would allow crew to bail out. But the fire had weakened wing structure. At approximately 200 feet altitude, the wing failed. Gremlins rolled inverted and crashed into ground. The impact triggered massive explosion from remaining fuel. There were no survivors. Hughes was posthumously awarded Medal of Honor. The citation specifically noted that he could have aborted the mission and possibly saved lives, but chose instead to complete the bombing run despite certain death, providing example of courage under fire that inspired his entire formation. Lieutenant Colonel Leon William Johnson, 32 years old from Moline, Kansas, commanded the 8-ball formation attacking Stoa Romana, White 1 refinery. This target was particularly difficult because the approach route required flying between massive refinery chimneys and distillation towers. The refinery infrastructure created obstacle course for aircraft flying at 50 feet. Chimneys rose hundreds of feet. Distillation towers created wind turbulence. Pipelines crossed above ground at varying heights. The pilots had to navigate through this industrial maze while under fire from anti-aircraft guns positioned on the structures. At 1,016 hours, Johnson led formation into the approach. The scene was surreal and terrifying. The bombers flew between chimneys that seemed close enough to touch. Smoke from the chimneys obscured visibility. The anti-aircraft fire was so intense that the air itself seemed solid. Johnson's bomber took multiple hits. One engine was damaged and losing power. Control cables were severed, making the aircraft difficult to steer. Hydraulic systems failed, affecting landing gear and flaps. The damage was accumulating rapidly, but Johnson maintained course. The 8-ball formation, following their commander, threaded through the chimney forest. Aircraft had to maneuver around obstacles while maintaining formation. Extraordinarily difficult flying that required complete concentration. One mistake would mean crashing into industrial structure at 200 miles per hour. Several bombers did crash. The B-24 Chattanooga Choo-Choo struck a chimney, tearing off part of the wing. The bomber rolled and crashed, exploding among refinery buildings. The B-24 Little Joe attempted to avoid a distillation tower, stalled at low altitude, and crashed into storage tanks. The explosions added to the inferno, engulfing the refinery. Johnson reached the bombing point at 1,020 hours. Despite the damage to his aircraft, despite the losses in his formation, despite the impossible flying conditions, Johnson held steady while bombs were released. The 8-balls put their bombs directly into Stoa Romana's critical infrastructure. Then came the escape. Johnson had to fly through the same obstacle course in reverse, this time with damaged aircraft and pursuing fighters. The bomber was barely controllable. Johnson fought the controls while his co-pilot handled throttles. Together they nursed the crippled bomber through the chimneys and away from Ploesti. Johnson's bomber made it back to Libya, barely. One engine failed on approach. Landing gear wouldn't extend fully. Johnson crash-landed, destroying the aircraft but saving his crew. Johnson was awarded Medal of Honor for leadership that inspired his formation to complete one of the most difficult bombing runs of the war despite catastrophic defensive fire and impossible flying conditions. Before we continue with the fighters that hunted damaged bombers across Romania, why Ploesti was repaired within weeks, making the strategic sacrifice questionable, and how 5 Medals of Honor in single mission reflected both extraordinary heroism and terrible cost. If you're fascinated by these stories of missions where courage faced impossible odds, of operations where strategic importance justified terrible casualties, of airmen who knew it was suicide but went anyway, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the air combat missions that don't get Hollywood movies, the raids where heroism came at terrible price, the operations where the question afterward was whether the cause was worth the objective. Now back to August 1st, 1943, and the gauntlet of fighters in Flak between Ploesti and safety. The bombers that survived the initial attack on Ploesti faced additional threat: German and Romanian fighters. Luftwaffe Me, 109 and Me, 110 fighters, along with Romanian IR, 80 fighters, had scrambled when the raid began. By the time bombers were escaping, the fighters were positioned to intercept. The B-24s were vulnerable, flying at low altitude to avoid radar. They couldn't use their normal defense of high-altitude formation, flying where concentrated offensive fire deterred fighter attacks. At 50 to 200 feet, the bombers were isolated targets struggling to reach safety. Many bombers were already damaged from flak. Engines were out. Control surfaces were damaged. Fuel was leaking. Crew members were wounded or dead. The damaged bombers couldn't maintain speed or maneuver effectively. They were easy prey for fighters. The Me-109 fighters attacked in diving passes, using altitude advantage to build speed, firing cannon and machine guns into bombers, then climbing away before defensive gunners could respond effectively. The attacks were methodical and deadly. The B-24 Sandman was intercepted by two Me-109s 40 miles from Ploesti. The fighters made repeated passes, methodically destroying engines. With 3 engines out and the 4th failing, Sandman crash-landed in a field. The crew survived and was captured. The B-24 Shoot Luke fought running battle with Romanian IR, 80 fighters for over an hour. The tail gunner, Sergeant Mike Rosnack, shot down one fighter, but was killed when another fighter's cannon shells hit the tail position. With the tail gunner dead and ammunition depleted, Shoot Luke was defenseless. The pilot attempted to reach Allied lines in Turkey, but ran out of fuel and crash-landed short of the border. Some bomber crews made desperate decisions to save themselves. The B-24 Daisy May, heavily damaged and pursued by fighters, attempted to reach neutral Turkey, approximately 200 miles east. The crew jettisoned everything to reduce weight: guns, ammunition, equipment. The bomber crossed into Turkish airspace on 2 engines and crash-landed. The crew was interned but survived. Other bombers attempted to reach Allied-controlled areas in North Africa, but ran out of fuel over the Mediterranean. Ditching a B-24 in the sea was extremely dangerous. The aircraft wasn't designed for water landings and usually broke apart on impact. Many crews died in ditching attempts. Those who survived ditching faced exposure, dehydration, and sharks while waiting for rescue that might not come. Of the 177 B-24 Liberators that departed Libya on August 1st, only 124 returned. 53 bombers were lost, 30% of the attacking force. This loss rate was catastrophic and unsustainable. No military organization could accept 30% casualties on missions and continue operations. The losses came from multiple causes. Approximately 35 bombers were shot down over or near Ploesti by anti-aircraft fire. These aircraft were destroyed by direct flak hits, structural failures from damage, or crashes after being crippled. The crews had little chance. Many died in explosions or crashes. Those who survived often had severe injuries. Approximately 8 bombers were shot down by fighters during the withdrawal. These aircraft were typically already damaged from flak and couldn't defend themselves effectively against fighter attacks. The fighter pilots showed no mercy. Damaged bombers were easy kills. Approximately 10 bombers were lost to other causes: operational failures, navigation errors, fuel exhaustion, ditching in the Mediterranean. These losses demonstrated the extreme difficulty of the mission, even without enemy action. Flying 2,400 miles round-trip at low altitude in formations pushed B-24 capabilities to absolute limits. The human cost was even more devastating. Each B-24 carried a crew of 10: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. 53 bombers meant approximately 530 men. Of these, 310 were killed, either in crashes from wounds or when aircraft exploded. Another 108 were captured as prisoners of war. Another 78 were interned in neutral countries like Turkey. Only 34 men from shot-down bombers successfully evaded and returned to Allied control. The casualties among returning bombers were also substantial. Many aircraft came back with wounded crew members. Some crew members died from wounds after landing. The total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, in turn, exceeded 660 men. This was approximately 38% of the airmen who flew the mission. Individual bomber groups suffered catastrophic losses. The 8 Balls, commanded by Colonel Johnson, lost 9 of 21 aircraft, 43% casualty rate. The Liberandos, which attacked Bucharest by mistake, lost 11 of 29 aircraft, 38%. The survivors were traumatized by what they'd experienced and by the losses of friends and crew members. The medical facilities of Benghazi were overwhelmed. Dozens of wounded men needed immediate treatment. The injuries were severe: burns, shrapnel wounds, gunshot wounds, broken bones from crashes. Many men required surgery. Some died despite treatment. The hospital tents became scenes of horror as doctors worked through the night, trying to save men whose bodies had been torn apart by war. The immediate assessment of Operation Tidal Wave was mixed. Reconnaissance flights over Ploesti in the days following the raid showed substantial damage. Several refineries were burning. Storage tanks had exploded. Infrastructure was destroyed. Initial estimates suggested Ploesti's production capacity had been reduced by approximately 40%, but these estimates proved overly optimistic. German and Romanian engineers began repairs immediately. The refineries were complex but redundant. Damage to some units could be compensated by operating other units at higher capacity. Critical equipment could be repaired or replaced. Production could resume in damaged facilities long before complete reconstruction. Within 2 weeks, Ploesti was producing approximately 60% of pre-raid capacity. Within 1 month, production was back to 85%. Within 6 weeks, Ploesti was operating at full capacity. The strategic objective, crippling Ploesti permanently, had failed. The damage was temporary. This reality forced painful questions. Had the sacrifice been worth it? 530 men flew the mission. Over 300 were killed, captured, or interned. 53 bombers, representing tens of millions of dollars investment and months of training, were lost, and Ploesti was repaired in weeks. Some argue the raid was strategic success despite limited physical damage because it demonstrated Allied capability to strike deep targets and forced Germans to allocate more resources to defending Ploesti and other oil facilities. This resource diversion, fighters, anti-aircraft guns, personnel, weakened German defenses elsewhere. Others argued the raid was strategic failure because the cost exceeded the results. 30% casualties were temporary damage that was repaired quickly was an acceptable exchange ratio. The same resources, 177 bombers and crews, could have been used for multiple missions against less defended targets with cumulative effect exceeding one spectacular raid. The debate extended to the tactical decisions during the mission. Should Kane, Baker, Johnson, and Hughes have aborted when surprise was lost and defenses were prepared? Their determination to complete mission despite impossible odds resulted in Medal of Honor awards, but also contributed to high casualties. Was pressing attack despite changed circumstances heroic leadership or unnecessary sacrifice? These questions had no easy answers. The military culture valued determination, courage, and mission completion. Kane, Baker, Johnson, Hughes, and Jerstad exemplified these values. They knew continuing meant death or capture, but chose to complete mission anyway. Their examples inspired formations to press through defenses that might otherwise have caused units to break and scatter. But the strategic result, Ploesti repaired quickly, raised questions about whether inspiration and heroism translated to effective military operations. Could the mission have been conducted differently? Should it have been conducted at all? The answers depended on perspective and what value was placed on intangibles like morale, demonstration capability, and message sent to Germans. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for Operation Tidal Wave, the most ever awarded for a single mission in American military history. The 5 recipients represented spectrum of heroism under fire. Colonel John Riley Kane received the Medal of Honor for leading Pink Formation through intense defensive fire despite his aircraft being fatally damaged, maintaining formation discipline that enabled successful attack, and ensuring his crew could escape before crash landing. Kane survived the war as prisoner and was released in 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John Jerstad received posthumous Medals of Honor for continuing toward target despite their bomber being engulfed in flames, completing bombing run despite certain death, and providing example that inspired their entire formation. Their dual award recognized shared decision and shared sacrifice. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes received posthumous Medal of Honor for continuing toward target despite his bomber being on fire, completing bombing run despite wing burning, and attempting to gain altitude for crew to bail out even though wing failure and crash were inevitable. Hughes' determination epitomized the spirit of the mission. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Johnson received Medal of Honor for leading his formation to the most difficult approach route, fly between refinery chimneys and structures while under intense fire, maintaining leadership despite severe damage to his aircraft, and completing bombing run that put bombs directly on target despite impossible conditions. Johnson survived and had a distinguished post-war career, retiring as general. The 5 Medals of Honor reflected both the extraordinary heroism displayed during the mission and the terrible cost that required such heroism. Commanders don't earn Medals of Honor for successful missions with light casualties. They earn them for missions where success requires superhuman courage and sacrifice. The awards generated some controversy. Some argued that awarding 5 Medals of Honor for a single mission devalued the award. Others argued that the mission's extreme difficulty and the recipient's extraordinary actions fully justified the awards. The debate continued for decades. What was clear was that Kane, Baker, Jerstad, Hughes, and Johnson represented hundreds of airmen who displayed similar courage on August 1st. Every crew that pressed through Flak over Ploesti knew they might not survive. Every pilot who flew at 50 feet through defensive fire was one mistake from death. Every bombardier who stayed at his station while Flak tore through the aircraft deserved recognition. The 5 Medal of Honor recipients represented all the men who flew Operation Tidal Wave. Their awards honored not just individual actions but collective determination of 1,700 airmen who accepted 30% casualties as necessary cost for a strategic objective. The 124 bombers that returned to Libya carried survivors who were physically intact but psychologically traumatized. What they'd experienced over Ploesti was beyond normal combat stress. Flying at 50 feet through concentrated defensive fire, watching bombers explode, seeing friends die, completing mission despite certain losses, these experiences left psychological scars. Many survivors couldn't sleep. When they closed their eyes, they saw Flak burst, burning bombers. Faces of crew members who hadn't returned. Nightmares were common. Some men woke screaming. Others couldn't sleep at all and walked around bases at night, trying to exhaust themselves. Survivor guilt was pervasive. Men asked themselves why they survived when friends died. Why did my bomber make it when the one next to me exploded? Why did I live when better men died? These questions had no answers but haunted survivors. Some men requested immediate return to combat. They wanted to prove to themselves and others that they weren't cowards, that they could face danger again. Others requested transfer to non-combat roles. They'd reached their limit and couldn't face flying another mission. Both responses were understandable and valid. The military's response to combat trauma in 1943 was limited. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist. Men were expected to cope through willpower and unit cohesion. Those who couldn't cope were labeled as lacking moral fiber rather than suffering from psychological injury. Some survivors developed drinking problems. Alcohol provided temporary escape from memories and guilt. Base medical officers noted increased alcohol consumption among Ploesti survivors, but attributed it to normal stress release rather than recognizing it as symptom of deeper trauma. The survivors formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. Men who flew through Ploesti together had shared experience that outsiders couldn't understand. Post-war, many survivors attended reunions, maintaining connections with men who understood what they'd experienced without needing explanations. The 108 American airmen captured after being shot down over or near Ploesti faced uncertain future as prisoners of war. Romanian forces captured most of these men. Treatment varied depending on circumstances and who captured them. Some crews were captured by Romanian military units and treated relatively well according to Geneva Conventions. They received medical treatment for wounds, food, and eventually transport to prisoner of war camps. The Romanians, aware that Germany might lose the war, were sometimes lenient with Allied prisoners. Other crews were captured by civilians, Romanian villagers, or workers. Treatment was harsher. Some airmen were beaten by angry mobs who blamed them for bombing damage. Several were killed by civilians before military forces could intervene. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants blurred when civilians saw bombers destroying their country. The captured Americans were eventually transferred to German control and sent to prisoner of war camps in Germany and occupied Poland. Stalag Luft III housed many Ploesti survivors. The camp was specifically for Allied aircrew, and conditions were relatively good by POW standards. Prisoners received Red Cross packages, could write letters, and organize activities to maintain morale. But life as prisoner was difficult. Food was inadequate. Medical care was limited. The psychological stress of captivity, not knowing when or if the war would end, separated from families, uncertainty about future, took toll. Some men attempted escape. Most failed and were returned to camps. A few succeeded in reaching Allied lines. The prisoners from Ploesti had unique status. The mission's fame meant German interrogators were particularly interested in extracting information about tactics, navigation, and future plans. The prisoners received more intensive interrogation than typical. Most resisted successfully, providing only name, rank, and serial number as required. Liberation came in 1945 as Allied forces advanced into Germany. The prisoners were freed by American or Soviet forces, depending on camp location. Most were in poor physical condition, malnourished, suffering from various illnesses, psychologically worn. But they survived. They came home. The debate about Operation Tidal Wave's value continued long after the war. Historians, military analysts, and veterans argued about whether the mission achieved worthwhile objectives given the cost. Proponents of the raid argued several points. First, the mission demonstrated Allied capability to strike targets deep in Axis territory. The 2,400-mile round-trip mission showed that Allied bombers could reach any target in Europe. This forced Germany to allocate resources to defending previously safe areas. Second, the raid forced Germany to strengthen Ploesti's defenses. After August 1st, Germany deployed additional anti-aircraft batteries, fighter squadrons, and smoke generation equipment to Ploesti. These resources, guns, aircraft, personnel, couldn't be used elsewhere. The resource diversion had strategic value, even if physical damage was temporary. Third, the raid demonstrated determination and courage that had propaganda value. News of the mission appeared in newspapers worldwide. The story of bombers flying at 50 feet through defensive fire inspired Allied populations and concerned Axis leaders. The psychological impact was difficult to quantify, but real. Fourth, the raid provided lessons for future operations. The experience demonstrated that ultra-low altitude attacks were possible but extremely costly. The lessons influenced planning for subsequent raids. The emphasis on surprise, coordination, and timing reflected Ploesti's lessons. Critics of the raid countered these arguments. First, the physical damage was repaired quickly. Ploesti was operating at full capacity within 6 weeks. The strategic objective, crippling oil production, failed. Temporary reduction in capacity wasn't worth 53 bombers and 660 casualties. Second, the ultra-low altitude tactics were never repeated exactly because the casualties were unsustainable. If the tactics couldn't be used again, the lessons learned had limited value. The mission demonstrated what not to do as much as what to do. Third, alternative approaches might have achieved better results. Multiple smaller raids over extended period could have caused cumulative damage, exceeding one spectacular raid. High-altitude raids with improved accuracy might have been less costly while achieving similar results. The decision to concentrate resources in single mission was questionable. Fourth, the heroism required to complete the mission reflected poor planning and execution. Medals of honor are awarded for extraordinary valor under fire, but ideally, missions should be planned so extraordinary valor isn't required. The fact that 5 medals of honor were necessary suggested the mission plan was flawed. The debate remained unresolved. Both sides had valid points. Ploesti was both inspiring demonstration of courage and questionable use of resources. The mission was both tactical brilliance and strategic failure. The truth incorporated elements of both interpretations. Operation Tidal Wave wasn't the end of Allied attacks on Ploesti. The refineries remained strategic target throughout 1943 and 1944. But subsequent raids used conventional high-altitude tactics rather than repeating the low-altitude approach. Beginning in April 1944, 15th Air Force based in Italy conducted series of high-altitude raids on Ploesti. These raids involved hundreds of heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, attacking from 20,000 feet with fighter escort. The raids were conducted in daylight with formations dropping thousands of tons of bombs. The cumulative damage from repeated high-altitude raids eventually exceeded what Operation Tidal Wave achieved. By August 1944, Ploesti's production capacity was severely reduced. When Romania switched sides and joined Allies in August 1944, Ploesti fell into Allied hands with facilities so damaged they couldn't resume full production. The irony was obvious. The spectacular low-altitude raid on August 1st, 1943, with 30% casualties and 5 Medal of Honor, caused temporary damage repaired in weeks. The methodical high-altitude raids in 1944, with much lower casualty rates per mission, caused permanent damage that crippled Ploesti. This comparison reinforced critics' arguments that Operation Tidal Wave was poorly conceived. The same objective, destroying Ploesti, was eventually achieved through less costly methods. The question remained whether the August 1st raid was necessary, or whether a patient campaign of high-altitude raids would have been more effective. Defenders argued the August 1st raid forced Germany to strengthen Ploesti's defenses, making subsequent raids more difficult. Without the initial spectacular attack, Germans might not have prioritized Ploesti's defense. The 1944 raid success depended partly on lessons learned from 1943's failure. Germans never expect to be 24s at 50 feet because heavy strategic bombers weren't designed to operate at altitudes designed for fighters. The expectation was that bombers stayed high, where they were safe from most ground fire and could drop bombs from altitude where accuracy was acceptable. Operation Tidal Wave violated these expectations. Bombers flying at treetop level, navigating through refinery chimneys, pressing through concentrated defensive fire. This wasn't how strategic bombing was supposed to work. But the mission's strategic importance and the limitations of high-altitude bombing justified the unconventional approach. The cost was terrible. 53 bombers lost. Over 660 casualties. 30% loss rate. These numbers represented catastrophic defeat by normal standards. But the mission was completed. Bombs hit targets. Refineries burned. The objective was achieved even if the strategic results were temporary. The 5 medals of honor awarded for the mission represented both the extraordinary heroism required and the terrible cost that made such heroism necessary. Kane, Baker, Jerstad, Hughes, and Johnson exemplified courage under fire. They made choices that resulted in their deaths or capture, but enabled mission success. Their examples inspired formations to complete attacks despite losses that might otherwise have caused units to break. But the awards also reflected questions about mission planning and execution. Should commanders have aborted when surprise was lost? Should formations have withdrawn when casualties exceeded acceptable levels? Should the mission have been planned differently to reduce risk? These questions have no definitive answers. Military operations always involve tension between completing objectives and preserving forces. Commanders must balance mission importance against cost. The decisions made by Kane, Baker, Johnson, Hughes, and Jerstad reflected their judgment that mission completion was worth ultimate sacrifice. From August 1st, 1943, from Benghazi to Ploesti back, from briefing rooms to burning refineries to prisoner camps, from 177 bombers to 124 returning to 53 lost, Operation Tidal Wave demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome impossible odds but couldn't guarantee strategic success. 50 feet altitude, 30% casualties, 5 medals of honor, 6 weeks repair time. The mission where bombers flew lower than safety allowed. The raid where heroism earned highest honors. The operation where strategic failure coexisted with tactical courage. The day when American airmen proved they would fly through hell if ordered, but raised questions whether the orders should have been given. Operation Tidal Wave, where Germans never expected bombers at 50 feet, where Americans lost 53 bombers to temporary damage, where 5 men earned medals of honor for missions that questioned whether heroism justified cost.